Springfield Church of the Brethren message of the week. Hi, this is Pastor Dave Weiss with a special bonus Springfield message of the week. This message is from our Bible study series on Esther for such a time as this. This is part 9, The Time Has Come, and the start of Purim. Have you ever seen the word Purim on the calendar? If you don't already know about it, you will today, but not for a few verses. So first, let's review. King Xerxes was somewhat deceived into making an irrevocable law at the urging of Haman to bring about the annihilation of the Jews. Queen Esther found out about the plot from Mordecai, her uncle and adoptive father, and with some urging, Mordecai convinced Esther to act. The urging brought about the key verse from this whole book of the Bible, Esther 4:14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. After that urging, Esther went to the king at great personal risk, eventually revealing Haman's treachery and sealing his fate. Haman was put to death. And after that, it appears, Xerxes saw the error of his ways, and while the annihilation law was irrevocable, Xerxes was now taking advice from people who have the best interests of him and his country at heart. As a result, the king has entrusted Mordecai and Esther with drafting a law that gave the Jewish people the right to defend themselves. Well, since all that took place at the end of chapter 8, 9 months have passed, and the day was at hand. If Esther did, in fact, come to her position for such a time as this, spoiler alert, she did, it is here in chapter 9 that the time has come. So let's go to the text. Esther 9:1. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. That 13th day of the 12th month was very important. By Haman's decree, it was the chosen day for the annihilation of the Jews. But now Mordecai was allowed by the king to make a decree countering the previous irrevocable law. Where before the enemies of the Jewish people should have been able to overpower the Jews, by Mordecai's decree, the Jewish people were allowed to assemble and defend themselves. As the text says, the decree really turned the tables, and the Jewish people, with the help of God, were able to overpower their enemies. Haman was the first person to die for his prideful hatred of God's chosen people, but on the 13th of Adar, many more would follow. Esther 9 verse 2 says this, the Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. This defense was not just in one place, rather it was empire-wide. Anywhere the Jews were attacked, they repelled the assault. No one could stand against God's people because God in his faithfulness came to their aid. Now, instead of their intended brazen attacks, the enemies of the Jews were cowering in fear. Verses 3 and 4 give us more. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. By this time, Mordecai was a powerful man, with the full backing of King Xerxes. So he not only had the king behind him, but the rest of the governing officials and the elite of society were also helping him in his cause. It says that fear of Mordecai seized them. Now, one would have to imagine, given the way that Mordecai conducted himself throughout this whole book, that the fear was likely due to his proximity to the king and his position, rather than the kind of behavior we got from Haman. We can even see this better in verse 4, where it says, his reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The good and trustworthy reputation he had bred trust among the people. One can imagine, after all of his unreliable advisors, Xerxes must have felt extremely confident in entrusting Mordecai with power. From here, the day becomes a day of battle. Look at verses 5 through 9. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adaliah, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Valzatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. Remember, the original annihilation decree allowed the people of the empire to kill the Jews at will and plunder their possessions. Mordecai's decree provided the Jews with the same right to plunder their enemies. Yet we see here and throughout the chapter, they did not take advantage of this right. It looks as though they simply killed all who attempted to do them harm. It really appears from the text, rather than motives of greed or even revenge, their primary actions were defensive. One might argue that the 10 sons of Haman were a matter of revenge, but if we look at verse 25, it appears the death of Haman's sons was part of the king's sentence on Haman. It's vital here that we remember something. Xerxes was not Jewish, and he was not bound by the laws of God, or at least he didn't see that he was. While slaying the sons for the sins of their father would not line up with God's law, Xerxes had the power to do this because he was the king. Note once again that even among the family of the man who actively worked for their annihilation, the Jews did not plunder Haman's family's no doubt considerable wealth. Look at verses 11 and 12. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will be granted." 500 people perished in the city. These were people who followed Haman's example of hatred and attacked the Jewish people. The price of hatred is high, and impulsive actions often lead to unintended consequences. Consider Xerxes, for example. It seems that Xerxes realized that if the body count in the city was this high, the death toll throughout the empire would be very high. It makes one wonder if Xerxes at any point stopped to think what might have happened if he had just stepped up and stopped Haman before the annihilation decree was made. How many lives could have been saved if he had simply asked Haman who they were going to kill? Still, the king was willing to listen to Esther and grant her request. Clearly, there is growing trust between them. Look at verse 13. "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles." This might seem surprising. Why would Esther ask for one more day of bloodshed? This is purely speculation on the part of the author, but could it be that she feared retaliation? After all, it seems there was one day reserved for the annihilation and the defense. What if some of the haters were laying low on the day of annihilation, fearing for their lives, and instead decided to delay their attacks to the next day? Perhaps this is why Esther asked for one more day. You might also say revenge is her motive. After all, Haman's sons had already been killed by this point, but she still wanted them to be impaled. Why would she want that? If not revenge, then what? Well, let's think about crucifixion for a moment. Why did the Romans crucify people? Oh, you could speculate that they were barbaric, and perhaps that is the case, but there was more. The Romans didn't crucify everyone. Roman citizens, for example, were usually beheaded. And while that is still terrible compared to crucifixion, it was quick and relatively painless. This is most likely how Paul was put to death. Crucifixion, like impaling, was making a statement. Remember when Jesus was crucified that Pilate placed a notice above his head that said, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," in not one but 3 languages? This was not an acknowledgement of Jesus' kingship. This was a threat. It was a statement that there is no king but Caesar, and this is what happens to anyone who says otherwise. Likewise, impaling the sons of Haman put their dead bodies on display, run through by a wooden pointed pole. That was a statement. That was a statement that says this is what happens to people who attempt to destroy the people of the queen. It almost seems as though Esther wanted to make sure that people would think twice before they decided to launch another attack on the Jews. Look at verses 14 and 15. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. The defense decree was extended for 1 more day in the city, and the death count was now 800 in Susa. And of course, counts from across the empire were still to come. The death toll was climbing. The sons of Haman were in fact impaled for the world to see. But once again, please note, the Jewish people did not claim the plunder that was rightfully theirs. Look at verses 16 and 17. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th, they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jewish people outside the city took only the 1 day and did not expand their defenses to 2 days as the Jews in Susa did. Remember, this is a huge empire, and it would have taken some time to spread the word of an additional 2nd day. The body count again was extremely high, 75,000 people. Once again, we see the high cost of hatred. Had these enemies of the Jews not attacked them, it is likely they would have been spared. After a day of battle, freed from their enemies, the Jewish people made the 2nd day, the 14th of Adar, a day of celebration. Look at verses 18 and 19. The Jews in Susa, however, assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day of giving presents to each other. As we'll see in a few moments, the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar are what eventually became the days of the Jewish holiday known as Purim. It's a time of celebration, with joyful feasting and the giving of gifts. Let's dig a little deeper. Go to verses 20 through 22. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. People tend to have short memories. This was a major intervention of God on behalf of his people. Mordecai knew this was an event that the Jewish people dare not forget. So Mordecai sent letters to all the Jewish people throughout the empire, directing them to reserve the 14th and 15th of Adar as a feast day of celebration, so they would never forget how God worked in the lives of his people. Think about it. Had God not intervened, if Esther had not stepped up for the lives of her people, there's a very good chance that they, at least from a human perspective, would have been wiped out. The key thing to remember, though, is that they were never left alone, and God was working for their good all through this. God was in control. Just as Christians celebrate Christmas and Easter to help us remember the great things God has done in our lives and to help us remember the birth and death and resurrection of Jesus, celebrations like Purim are reminders for the Jewish people of God's faithfulness across time. Think about it. This is yet another time when we see God's promise to Abraham fulfilled. the promise of a great nation, of blessing those who bless Israel and cursing those who curse Israel, as well as the ultimate fulfillment in the blessing of all nations through Jesus Christ. Purim is a day of celebration instituted to help the people to remember. But why is it called Purim? The answer is found all the way back in Esther chapter 3, but before we go there, let's look at verses 23 to 26. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pure, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore these days were called Purim, from the word pure, because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. This is not one of the feast days that God had established at the time of Moses, and yet it is a reminder to the people of God's faithfulness. And in fact, the Jewish people celebrate it to this very day. We see in verse 24 that the day is called Purim because Haman cast the pure, another name for lot, similar to dice, to determine the day when he would annihilate the Jews. The plural of the word pure is Purim, hence the name. Look at Esther 3:7. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select the day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Consider this for a moment once again. Haman cast dice to determine what day he would use to kill off a whole race of people. Can you imagine how flippant you would have to be about the value of human life to do such a thing? Yet ironically, the person who angered Haman by refusing to bow to him, Mordecai, is the one who set the day of celebration on the very day that Haman's lot selected. What Haman meant for evil ended up being a day of celebration for the Jewish people. The day Haman intended to be a day of mourning and death for all Jews ended up being a day of celebration for the Jewish people that's lasted for thousands of years. What a testament to the faithfulness of God. The rest of the chapter deals with a new decree, a decree of that very celebration for all future generations. Look at verses 27 to 32. The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among the descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. Once again, Mordecai is sending letters to all the Jewish people. Letters sent out in the full authority of the king for a celebration that has outlasted empires. The letters were filled with words of goodwill and assurance, words to affirm the faithfulness of God and our hope in Him. As we close this chapter, know this: we serve and worship the same God, and He is just as faithful to us as He was to them. Today, we may not face the kind of threats that the Jewish people faced at the time of Esther, but we will face struggles of our own. How good is it to be able to rest in the faithfulness of our God, who is faithful yesterday, today, and forever. Amen. This has been the Springfield Church of the Brethren Message of the Week from Pastor Dave Weiss.